Hello lovely people and welcome. Today I will be painting a picture based on a photograph I took in Iceland a few years ago. Here's the photograph. Iceland is utterly spectacular, and this was taken from the coast, obviously, out into the ocean with these beautiful silhouettes of rocks rising out of the water and the sparkles on the water. So I'm going to try to recreate this, or something close to this, in watercolor and ink. I have tried to do this picture twice before. Once I did it in colored pencils, and I actually really liked how that came out. Unfortunately, I carried that sketchbook around with me, and the pages rubbed and the picture got ruined by getting horribly smudged. I also tried to do it once in straight watercolor, but the contrast wasn't good enough and it really didn't work. So for this, I thought I would use watercolor for the sky and the sea, and then a nice India ink for the rocks, and maybe that will be a nice opaque silhouette, good contrast, and work out well. So I started by doing a sketch, and then for the really bright sparkles on the water, I'm using artist's masking fluid. Yeah, for these sparkles right around the edge of the rocks and right in the front here. And hopefully that will work out pretty well. And this is why I did the sketch, so that I knew where to put these sparkles. So artist masking fluid, as I've used this before several times. It's basically a vinyl. It just sticks to the page and prevents the paint from sticking there. The tool I'm using for this is actually a tool for nail polish art. It's a dotting tool for nail art, but I find it works very well with the artist's masking fluid. I let that dry, and then I prepared some watercolors, and I put the paper at an angle so that the sky gradient will flow and mix well downward. That's a nice trick when you're doing gradients, is to put the paper at a slight angle. So I'm working heavily wet into wet, making the paper very wet with a great deal of water, and making sure that it's evenly distributed across the page. And I'm only going down to the horizon line, which is a little bit lower than the center. There's a little bit of paint on the brush still from when I mixed up the colors, but that's not a big problem. And then I load up the brush fairly heavily with the paint and start at the very top and just go across and back and forth. And as I work my way down, the color will thin out and you get a nice little gradient. And also, since the paper is at an angle, it helps it blend and work its way down. And this is a good way to get some very nice gradients in there. And I keep darkening the color at the very top and then pulling it down over and over. And doing that just strengthens the gradient each time. And I added a little bit of a different shade of blue up at the top, kind of a grayer blue. I think that worked out pretty well. And then to make the clouds, I just go in with some bunched up Kleenex, and this is a technique that only works when the watercolor is still wet, but then it works pretty well. Once the watercolor is dry, it won't come off the page anymore. But while it's wet, you can go in and pull out the clouds. And so I'm not worrying about where the rocks are, since I'm going to go back in later with an opaque ink. I'm not worrying about that at all for this. So this way I think actually the clouds will look more natural behind the rocks when I'm done, since I'm not worrying about stopping them on one side and starting them again on the other. I can make my clouds go across, and then the rocks will just block them, and that'll work out fine. Once I did the first round with the clouds, I thought the edges were a little too sharp. So I went back in with just water on the brush and added just a little bit of water around the edges of the clouds to fuzz them out a little bit. And that worked. It worked a little bit too well. So you can see, especially with this cloud in the middle, that the water is progressing out into the blue paint a little too much. So then I went back over, again, this is just a wet brush, there's no paint on it, and around the clouds, around the edges there, and kind of brushed that water out and smoothed it into the gradient, and went back in with the paper, with the Kleenex, and pulled out a little more of that. And then I thought that gave the clouds, that double, two-step procedure, gave the clouds a more fuzzy edge, different levels of intensity, kind of like they're fading in and out here and there, and I thought that worked very well. Then I went back in, I made up a more of a gray blue for that one band of clouds that sits just above the horizon line. There often is a band of clouds that's lower than the others, and I made it slightly grayer and just went across the entire page with that gray to put in that, and not going all the way down to the horizon line, but staying above it a little bit and going just up a little bit. And there were a few little clouds below that too that I put in. And right along the top of that band there was a little more highlight, so I went back in with the Kleenex and pulled that out. Skies are really interesting. I'm still working on learning them. But overall I think this one came out pretty well. I went back in and tried to add a little bit more shadow and depth to the clouds up above. And by now the first gradient that goes all the way down to the horizon has dried pretty much completely while I've been working up with the clouds up above it. So then I can go in and just wet the bottom half, the part that's the Seascape. And for this I mixed up a blue. I added in a little bit of green and a little bit of black to get a much more gray blue with a bit of green color and a darker color. And then I just went in, and I didn't want to do a gradient this time. It's more of a flat everywhere to start with, and then I added in darker areas with the brush. And again, I'm working very wet into wet here. You can see the sheen on the paper. And I'm working on a watercolor block, so the paper stays pretty flat. It's pretty good about not bowing up or collecting little areas that the watercolor can pool and end up being weirdly shaped splotches. And then I went in with a more concentrated paint and just touched it in places, and because it's so wet, that paint kind of flows into the background color well and looks much more natural. So I liked that. I thought that worked out pretty well. One thing I did forget was just how much watercolor lightens up when it dries. So this ended up a lot more dry. And then the other thing I tried to do for the sparkles in the water, and this is a technique I haven't done before, is I used table salt, just regular table salt, and sprinkled it around in the areas that had a lot of water reflections, a lot of sunlight sparkling here and there. So there's more salt up in the areas right around the big rock that had a lot of light reflection, a little more. And then down at the very bottom I had some sea salt, which is bigger granules. It's not quite as finely ground. And so for the parts that are closer in and that are bigger speckles, I put that in. So I just put that, let it sit on top of the paper, and let it dry. And then when I came back and dusted off the salt, I went in and with the ink and put in my rocks. And this is just a flat India ink, Winsor & Newton India ink, and just made the silhouettes of the rocks. I did go in and put in a second layer later, and my QuickTime crashed while I was recording that, so I don't have the recording of that, but it's just going over all of these with ink again, so you can probably fill that in your head yourself. And then I decided that the salt experiment worked pretty well, but the splotches were a little too big and a little more crystalline looking, like snowflakey in shape than I liked. So I went in with the paintbrush, and also since the ocean was much lighter than I wanted to darken it up anyway. So I spent a bunch of time just kind of dancing the paintbrush around all the little speckles, making them a little smaller, putting down water between them, and then letting the paint flow along the water. Watercolor water. The nice thing about watercolor is you can prepare a spot with water and then add the color and let it just flow into the water and spread out on its own. And so I did that for a little while, and I liked that, but I still thought the speckles themselves were a little too white. So after that, I went in with it's kind of what's called glazing, which is doing a layer of watercolor over an already dried layer. So I went in and did a combination of kind of specifically going around the speckles and also doing a layer of watercolor over them just to soften them a bit, and then also some more darkening of the ocean. And then I let that dry and peeled off all the resist, and I'm really happy with the result this time. I think it worked out very well. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And yeah, I think this one worked out very well. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. And if you like this, if you want to see more, please do subscribe. Hit the subscribe button down below. I try to do this once a week. And I also tried a different editing kind of method this time. I'm not sure what I thought of it. But anyway, let me know what you think. And thank you so much for watching. Take care.